Hi, everyone. Welcome to another book discussion between the Ann Arbor District Library and the Unerased Book Club. We are excited to be here tonight to discuss the novel Shark Dialogues, which is by Kiana Davenport. Before we get started, we'll just quickly go around and introduce ourselves and do a brief visual description if you are comfortable doing that. So I'll go ahead and get started. I'm Lucy. I am a library tech at AADL. I work in the youth department, but I also do adult programming like these book discussions. And I am a white female in my early 50s wearing a yellow sweater. I have shoulder length brown hair, glasses, and I'm sitting in front of some books.
I'm Emily. I am a librarian at AADL. I manage part of the adult nonfiction collection and do primarily programming for adults. I am a white woman in my mid-30s. I'm wearing a green t-shirt and a blue hoodie. I have medium length, curly-ish, reddish hair, and I pulled back in a ponytail, and I am sitting in front of a mostly white wall with a print of Matisse's goldfish behind me.
I can go next. My name's Laura. I'm a desk clerk at the Ann Arbor District Library, and I also work a lot of events at the library. I am a white woman in my late 20s with dark brown hair pulled back in a bun and wearing glasses and a gray sweater. And I'm sitting in front of a white wall with some like sticks and like decor behind me.
Hi, I'm Anne. I am a book processor at Westgate primarily, and I am a mid-40s heavyset white woman. I'm wearing a black cardigan over a kind of salmon-colored shirt. I've got glasses, longish hair that's kind of blending into the background of my sweater, and I'm sitting in front of some white pantry doors.
Hi, my name is Jacob. I'm an Ann Arbor District Library employee where I work on the outreach team. I am a 31-year-old white male, a bigger fella sitting in front of, I got dirty blonde hair with a beard, and I'm sitting in front of a white wall.
And hi, everyone. I'm Sheela. I'm the founder and co-facilitator of Unerased Book Club. With me is my daughter, who's 2 years old and also an avid reader. And we are sitting in front of a bookshelf and a white wall. And I am a South Asian woman with longer black hair, glasses, and in my early 30s. And we're so excited to talk about this book today. Yeah. That's Mama and Shafali. That's right. We're very excited to talk about Shark Dialogues. The premise of the The premise of the novel is a multi-generational history, like telling of a family's history, but set against the backdrop of Hawaii's colonialism and annexation by the United States and things that have happened in contemporary history. So I do want to just preface that I'm only about a fifth of the way through. So spoilers are totally cool, but this book is dense and in a really good way. So it's just taken me a lot longer to get through than I had anticipated. So I'll open it up by asking what people thought about it and how far did you make it in the book?
I think dense and a lot to get through is a good description of it. I've got my book here, and it's a chunky one. I did make it all the way to the end, which surprised me a little because I picked it up too late. I would say that I'm really glad that I read this book, because if I didn't have to for this group, I would have stopped reading it. But I learned a lot about Hawaii, and I also found myself learning quite a bit of Hawaiian words. This book has a very thorough glossary, and quickly I realized, because at least my book is that really annoying paper that's cut that makes it hard to flip pages. So I took pictures of the glossary on my phone, and I'm going to do that for all books with glossaries in the future, because it meant that I looked up everything that I didn't know. And then I eventually learned the things that repeated. So this was a book that I appreciated for the education it gave me. And I really enjoyed about the first third to half of it. And then I found my interest fading as the story continued more into the more contemporary parts.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I was not able to complete the book myself. I read up until it switched over to the granddaughters, which I think is like modern times, which was like the 90s. I learned so much about the history of Hawaii, the colonization of Hawaii, Hawaiian culture. I really loved the parts like uh, the very 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 patriarch of this family, like as far as it goes back, the oldest white guy. I liked reading about him being up on the ship. That was interesting, and I liked reading about like what life was like for that fella on the leprosy camp. Those parts really flew for me. When I got to the modern granddaughters, Kiana Davenport, the buy-in that I put into reading this book had been spent, and I was calling it a crisis of conscience earlier today with Emily, where I'm like, I'm not loving this, and then it's like, well, why would you read something that you're having a hard time reading? I'm just gonna put it down, and then when I put it down, there was like a day of guilt, and then there was freedom.
I would say I had a very similar experience to both Emily and Jacob. I did finish the book and I learned a lot. I learned a lot about Hawaiian history. I learned a lot about like the history of leprosy and Hansen's disease in Hawaii. And I really, I went and like read a whole bunch of other stuff about that because I had no idea that it was so much of the research around it was done there in Hawaii. And I found that really fascinating. I learned a lot about like certain gangs in Japan and the whole the ritual around like full body tattoo that went along with those gangs that I thought was really interesting. So just this book kept taking me on these paths to learn about other things, which I really enjoyed about it. I found myself getting confused a little bit about which character's story was which, or kind of who they belonged to with the granddaughters, like whose daughter was whose daughter was whose daughter. And I think some of that came out of the author repeating herself a lot, like not necessarily with the characters, but like at the same, I felt like there were some circles we were going in a little bit. And so I think that kind of muddled it for me a little bit. And I also had a hard time finding a character that I wanted to like grasp onto and identify with and learn more about. But like you said, Emily, I'm glad I read it for this because it propelled me to keep going, and I really did learn a lot.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you said, Lucy. I found it kind of confusing to follow which character they were and like the timelines, because I did see that the book kind of jumped from different time periods, and I think the cyclical circular part of it with the characters, I wonder if she intentionally did that to show how they were like so interconnected with their culture throughout the years and the deep rich history there. So I did find that to be the hardest part about like keeping the characters differentiated. And I unfortunately wasn't able to get through all of it as well because I picked it up too late and I didn't realize how dense and descriptive it is. So it really took me a while to get through the parts that I did. I did get about halfway through, but I do want to continue reading it because I'm loving the history and learning a lot about Hawaii and like Emily mentioned, Hawaiian words, things I've never heard of before. And I think the author did interspersed that like the historical elements with the fiction and even like the magical realism in a really good way.
So I had a tiny bit of a different experience with it. I ended up, after reading about a quarter of it, I realized I was not going to get through it. And so I got the audiobook and listened to it on 1.5 speed until today when I finished it on 2.5 speed, which, is a slightly different experience. I agree in loving the kind of history lessons that I was getting. I also really just kind of grabbed onto the family story and got really frustrated by I guess that I'll call her the main protagonist, the grandmother that is kind of the matriarch of the current day or 90s day family, because she treated her children and her granddaughters not the greatest and kind of spent most of her life pushing them away, in some ways at the behest of her love, Duke, the man who was living in the leper colony, because of his pride in not wanting them to know about his disease. And it just frustrated me because it's kind of like she was torpedoing her relationship with these future generations, and then was realizing at the end of her life, like, oh crap, I don't have, I'm not passing on what I want to pass on to them. So I was engaged, but also frustrated with that familial dynamic. I also found it really interesting, her intolerance to the biracial and multi-racial grandchildren and choices of spouses of her daughters, while she actually was descended of this multiracial great grandparents. I don't know. I was really engaged with it, but I was troubled by things in it as well.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that being like Pono was her name. She was frustrating to me for all the reasons you just listed, and but also that like she did something that a lot of the other female characters did, which is like they would kind of drop everything or push aside everything for a man and not necessarily a healthy relationship with a man. Like they were very, there was like these very physically driven relationships, which is what it is. But I just felt like I wish there had been a portrayal of one woman there where that wasn't the case with her, and maybe that's because that was behavior that whether or not they knew it was modeled for them, and that's why that history repeated itself. But I did find myself wishing that there was one situation where they weren't so compelled to sort of just dive into these not necessarily healthy relationships and sort of push other things aside for men.
You say that, and even romantic relationships aside, I don't know that there were any healthy relationships in the book at all. And thinking about that, like obviously you need some unhealthy relationships to make a book compelling and readable generally. But I think that was one of the things I struggled with, was that there was no one that I liked very much, which doesn't necessarily, there are plenty of books I read where I don't like the characters. But there wasn't there was so much bleakness. There wasn't a lot of goodness. And even the moments of good were still, people never saw each other. They saw past each other, or maybe they only saw in hindsight. And that meant that it was less rewarding, I think, for me to read, because while I didn't particularly care for the characters, I also didn't care for where they ended up and what the resolution was with them.
May I ask, why did Pono summon her granddaughters back to Hawaii, and what secrets did she share with them? And then it doesn't sound like there was really a resolution as to their relationships, but do you mind filling in those plot holes for me that I didn't read?
So feel free to jump in, anyone else, especially Anne, who so recently learned this. But essentially, Pono was seeing in her dream, she was seeing that she would be leaving, whether it was death or something else. And so she brought them there to fill in a little bit. She did tell them about their grandfather, and they perhaps this is one more fulfilling or wholesome moments. They do meet him. They get to meet Duke getting towards the end. But she needs someone to take over the family business, the coffee business. And so they end up finding their purposes in different ways. Jess, and this I guess was okay. As you're having me tell the plot, I'm also finding more things where I was like, oh, well, this was a nice moment. Jess ended up finding herself and connecting more with her Hawaiian roots than she ever had, and worked with Run to carry on the farm. Vanya got much more into her activism, and that is like the last 100 pages or so of the book is a lot of their planned bombing and the outcomes of that. And Rachel Hero, her husband, dies, and she finds out some secrets about him, but she also then inherits a bunch of his money and has power for the first time in her life, and is deciding kind of how to deal with her grief and also how to deal with the power she has and what responsibility she might have for cleaning up some of Hero's messes.
And then
Ming dies relatively early on, uncertain in the book whether it is more due to the lupus or more due to her drug use.
Yeah, and Ming's death is what brings about Pono deciding that she's going to go against Duke's wishes and tell the granddaughters, because it was Ming's dying request, because Ming had found out about the grandfather and recognized that knowledge was something that was really important to the granddaughters, because it's not just that they didn't know who this grandfather was and their mothers didn't know who their father was. It really seemed to have been messing up their entire lives. Like, not having that rooting was a major barrier for them kind of developing, which again, that's kind of putting the man's role in the life as the key driver to your happiness, which is not the best message.
So I will say, when we picked this book, we were looking for Hawaiian representation in the mix of books, and this book consistently comes up as like a must read to know about Hawaii. And because I also got it too late, it wasn't at our library. I couldn't find it as an ebook through any of the libraries I have access to. And so I had to purchase it, which was fine, but that takes time to get then. And I looked at it, started reading it. And I thought, man, how am I going to even crack the first few chapters? And all of the reviews I saw online, like people love it, or like it's kind of a mixed bag. They love the idea of it, but the writing is unnecessarily dense at times. Baby is right there. That's right. Do you want to talk about the book? Do you want to show the book? Can you show them your book? You sure? Did you read it? Yeah. Okay. But like, I wish that there was a lot more emphasis on the earlier generations. Like that felt really uneven. Like you get the first story, which is quite extensive, and then the 2 generations after that are really cut short. And you're like, well, I feel like there's a lot of potential juiciness that we could have gotten from there if we're going to talk about like the history of Hawaii, or maybe even the interpersonal dynamics and how that shapes the conversations later on, which I haven't gotten to yet. But if this is a 500-page book, it feels unequally distributed.
Well, and I was a little surprised because typically the places where these kind of epics lose me is in the earlier pieces. And I don't know if it was just that it was doing a really good job of filling in gaps in my knowledge about Hawaii. And so that interested me. Even just like the little tidbits about how everyone was issued a gas mask after the Pearl Harbor bombing. That was probably a little traumatic, I guess, for them to teach us when they taught us about Pearl Harbor in 5th grade. And so it was just something I had never come across or learned about. And when we got to the more modern characters, who I assumed would be the ones that would be easier for me to connect to, we got less of the Hawaiian culture, I think, because they needed to move the family plot forward. Like I can understand why those narrative decisions might have been made, but I didn't realize how much it was learning about Hawaii that was keeping me enjoying reading. Because I think I really did. I have started taking notes about the books that I read just very briefly. And it started out like, oh, I'm reading this book for work. And, I wouldn't have picked it up, but I feel like I'm really like vibing with it. And then 2 days later, I was like, oh gosh, I'm still reading the same book for work. And now I've changed my mind. So I don't know, maybe those of you who've read the first third or first half, maybe consider that. And your experience could totally be different from mine, but those are the bits that I am going to remember and take away from the book. Just because those were the things that expanded my worldview the most.
I will
totally
say
agree.
that not embracing, but looking at the kind of activism side of things and how to kind of fight to preserve Hawaiian culture, I recognize that force is sometimes involved in those things, but the fact that it kind of turned towards that being the only way that we were addressing preserving, aside from also preserving the land that they owned this farm on, I felt like it was doing a disservice to other ways that they kind of started off talking about, but then veered away to spend so much time on this kind of bomb action sequence towards the end of the book. And I don't know if that was just trying to make this climactic thing. That's the part that I was listening to at 2.5 speed, and I was kind of okay with that.
I did find myself like, I think maybe it was just the editing was uneven, or it's like she was telling this great story and then she kind of got tired of telling it and then was like, no, wait, I want to get back into it felt like not quite getting, like you thought it was going to reach this climax and then it didn't. It was like, okay, they met the grandfather and then all of a sudden we're getting this exciting story about activism, but it just felt disjointed. And I did find myself thinking a lot while I was reading it. Like, I just wish some editor had stepped in or helped to just narrow down some parts, even just taking out some of the words in the sentences, and then helping to bring that focus back to other parts, because there were things where I felt like I was learning a lot, things where I could have learned more and there wasn't anything there to give me more.
I wonder too, this book was published in 1994. And so I wonder if the pressures both on the author's side and on the publisher's side of like, this is our one chance for representation. I was a kid in the 90s, so I don't really know how Hawaii was being represented in literature written for adults. But I think about, living in Michigan, you think of Hawaii as vacation destination, and that's it, and not thinking of the native people and how does this work as native people living in some place that is just hit with tourists and then becomes dependent on tourists. So these are complicated ideas. And so I can see the challenge of trying to perhaps fit too much in, which seems to be the case for this.
In that same vein, it makes me wonder if the author, the writing style was very literary, capital L, literary. And she was doing tricks and being showy in a way that was very capital L literary. I know the type of reader I am. I don't respond well to that. But I wonder if she did that to nestle the book into a higher brow type of epic for reasons that are I don't know. It was really literary. There's so many words, so many nouns. Some of the author did was they would take a paragraph and turn it into a run-on sentence. And it's just like, okay, you're writing literature. I struggle with that clearly. And I even struggle with describing my struggle with that. Because it's just not, that's where I instantly detach.
I will say that listening to it helped a lot with that. The performer was really, really good. And kind of helped separate some of the characters in my mind, so that I knew who was speaking at any given moment, or even who was thinking. Lucy, to your point about it feeling a little disjointed, I noticed on the now I can't think of what the page is called, the copyright page. It makes mention of the fact that some of the chapters appeared in another book in some form before this. And I'm wondering how much of it may have been some chapters existed and they don't fit quite as well with other chapters.
That makes so much sense. That really. So maybe it was even a case of someone saying you need more here, or pull this in. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I'm extrapolating from the book. I don't know if you all remember in like 2020 and 2021, how many people were going to Hawaii, and how many Hawaiians are saying, please stop coming here. Because if you have COVID, like if you get us, like we're screwed. Hold on, sweetheart. That's right. We can look at those pictures in a second. Sorry. Sorry, guys. There you go. And reading now about about the leprosy really puts into context even more to how traumatic being stuck on an island with COVID would be. If there's this history of a deadly disease that forces people to be excommunicated from their families, and there's violence enacted on their families if they try to help you or try to keep you, and how it creates like second-class citizens immediately. Like that type of trauma just doesn't go away.
Yeah, my main takeaway from this book, in addition to learning the history, was like, not that Hawaii was on my travel list, as not really a beach person, but it was, I don't think I would feel good about going to Hawaii as a tourist. And it just made me think about how we choose the places that we go. And how do you balance the learning about a culture and respecting the culture and also being on vacation and all of those pieces. It complicates things in a way that it's easier if you don't think about it, but I'm glad that I'm starting to wire myself to think about those things more, because I don't know, it feels like the more responsible thing to do, but it does. So yeah, I don't think I'm going to go to Hawaii.
And the history of American colonization in Hawaii is so incredibly violent. That's something that the book brought to life very vibrantly. I kept thinking to myself, oh, what an immense amount of senseless violence that is the historical foundation on which the Hawaiian people then have to exist. Also, how I don't know the word for this, but like workers' rights, like union stuff, like how labor was tied into that as well. I'll never open a can of pineapple and not think of people's fingers getting cut off, just so you can have a piece of pineapple tidbits to put in your Watergate cake. It's like, oh man, that's really tough.
I'll show you. I'm sorry. That's been repeated with American Samoa in Arkansas. Sorry, she's looking at photos. In Arkansas with meat packing factories. And I'll have to find it. I can send it around. But there used to be a really good serialized podcast. It's like time bound for each season out of Hawaii. And in season 1 or 2, they talk about American Samoas in these meatpacking industries and how still oddly precarious their, not just their lives, but like their status in this country is, even though they're also a territory. It should have full rights. And like now we're thinking about moving forward in 2025, what does that look like when you have an administration that wants to do mass deportations and doesn't really understand what they're doing?
Now, Laura, not to put you on the button, but I feel like I've seen so many times you were about to say something and somebody else started saying something. So I wanted to give you a shout out if you're looking to say something.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I was gonna speak, Anne just mentioned that she listened to the audiobook, and I found that the audiobook was really great as well. And so I just wanted to say that was a way that I was able, I feel like, to get through the parts I did get through, and it was a really beautiful narration. So I would suggest that perhaps if to get through the more denser parts of the book. It also was, I really enjoyed the learning about Pono and her gift to be kind of like a prophesize or see the future and things that will happen through her dreams. I thought that was interesting. I don't normally like magical realism or books about stuff like that mixed with fiction, but it was interesting how the author had more of a fantastical element, history, fiction, all and romance is all mixed in one. So I did enjoy that about the books, or about the book.
There is magic kind of sparkling on the throughout every kind of part of this book. And I feel like the author put a lot of work into capturing a lushness. And that lushness, a part of that is the nature of the islands, and is also represented in the magic that Pono possesses. But also, and I'll use my words well in front of Shefali, there's a sensuality, a sensualness that I think is a part of that magic. It didn't work for me, but I think it added to this aura of sparkling, glittering, interesting magic, sensuality, zhuzh.
Yeah, I
I
feel
am.
it's not everyone's. I was just gonna say it's probably not everyone's cup of tea, but I liked those parts. But if you're not a fan of that like romance sensuality part, if you're looking for more just like historic or more, I don't know, it's give or take how much you might enjoy it.
I think it's interesting how you were saying, Laura, how she connects, like she's doing this historical novel, but also magical realism, but then like making actual connections between those things. Like I really did like how Pono had the ability to dream people's futures and realities, and then she monetized that. Like she turned around and used that to make money and turn that into a business. So it's taking this thing that like we would see as um magical realism, but for her it's not, it's her gift, and then turning it into a very real concrete thing that helps to you know provide her with an income when she can't really make money anyway any other way. So I just I thought that was a really interesting way to sort of show that like the magical realism is actually it's just part of, it's like inherent to who they are, it's part of the story in a multi-connected way.
In some ways, that kind of echoes the tourism industry in that they're taking advantage of the gifts that they have been given by the land of Hawaii and making money from it, because so much, including land, has been taken away that they're left without a lot of other ways to survive and live.
I mean, you even see that now, like in the past year, there've been really in your face, like examples of the discrepancy of the haves and the have-nots, and the haves, it's the have-nots being Hawaiians and like having to cram multiple generations into really small homes because developers need to use the land to build up massive hotels. Or even after the wildfires that wiped out primarily, like the people who were hurt the most were Hawaiians. So it sounds like maybe this is like a 5 out of 10 recommendation. Like you have to be into certain things to want to read this book. Yes, I see a lot of head nodding.
Yes,
Yeah,
except
and
I think if you're interested in learning about the history, but prefer it in a narrative story as opposed to just reading a history book, I would put it at like a 7 to 8.
And I think too, especially if you're reading it and you aren't about to go talk about it with people, the feeling free to skim and or read the first half. I will say pretty early on, in addition to taking pictures of all of the glossary, which I would recommend doing, I made a little family tree. I think if this book were published now, they would have done that work for us and put it in the front. But I just kind of drew it out myself. And that helped immensely with keeping track of what each character's past was, and especially with the various frustrations that Pono had with the various mixed ancestry her grandchildren came from, it was helpful for me to know who I was drawing those lines between and which mother was this. So if someone does want to dive in, if you do that from the beginning instead of flipping back pages like I did, it wouldn't be a lot of work and would be worth it. Essentially, Pono, 4 daughters, 4 granddaughters, you've got it covered.
That's such a good idea. I wish I'd done that because I feel like the daughter generation got lost. There was like Pono and the granddaughters, but there were these daughters. They were mentioned briefly, but then not really. So I wish I had kept track of them the way you had, Emily.
I was going to say that kind of happened with every other generation, but I think the 2 generations above Pono both got kind of disappeared in the storytelling. I think this book is also a really good example of generational trauma, because all of those things that happened due to colonialism are kind of being passed down and experienced in one way or another by the modern generation.
Yeah, that, and then also I feel like there it was mentioned that there was like a curse put on the family by the original gosh, what's her name? Kalinkani or Kalikokani? I forget her name, but she was the one who's kind of like shunned from her father, and thus the family kind of suffered every generation with their generational trauma. And it was interesting to see how they all had tragic things that happened in their stories.
I did have to keep reminding myself too that this book was written like 30 years ago, so it's like because some of the word choices were sometimes surprising to me, and I think I had to like keep reminding myself, otherwise it could seem it's like kind of pulls you out of the story to be like, wait, that's not the word I would have used there. But so it's always interesting to think about like when a book was written, if it's historical fiction, what time period is it being written about, and then in what time period are you reading it? And so it's like you have to kind of reconcile those 3 different things in your head, and that can make for like a difficult but also interesting reading experience if you start to put those pieces together.
You're so right. I had to remind myself that it was from the early 90s because there are so many characters and there's so many generations represented. I'm like, so nobody's gay. Nobody. But that's a very modern reader, which is awesome. Love that. That's kind of something that I expect now to be represented in a book like this. But it is an idea I had while reading it. I'm like, so where we at?
Yeah, I had the same thought, and then I was like, wait, no, that's would have been
Or maybe
a bigger deal,
It was the uncle who got addicted to opium. Maybe he. I'm just thinking of like, who could they hide?
Yeah.
He does get married towards the end, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything.
It reminds me of when we read I Can See the Cover. I can see the cover so brightly in my mind. It was about the immigrants from India farming in California.
Passage West.
Passage West.
Passage West.
Mhm.
I just think that book handled queerness in such an interesting and really cool way. And I was like, can we inject a little bit of that in here? But I understand that this what I'm saying doesn't really matter too much. It's just a thought that came to me while reading this particular book.
Queerness as kind of a deviant thing came up a little bit with Rachel's husband, Hiro, who was in the Yakuza, because she makes reference to him dressing her up as a little boy and kind of pretending that. And then after he dies, there are references to young men, including in addition to young women in his employ in the kind of nefarious trades in Thailand. So not a great representation.
And to be clear, queerness can be represented. Queer people don't need to be heroes in books all the time, or they really. I love it when queer people are evil or what have you, as long as it's not in a stereotypical way. But these questions about representation and what we expect as modern readers, and what we expect from authors, is something that interests me. And I'm glad we were able to kind of touch on that nerve a little bit and investigate further.
I mean, this book was very long, and it feels like it could have been, again, like editing, publishing rules at the time. Who knows if they would have allowed multiple, like not versions, but just multiple parts to it. I feel like that would have just saved everyone a little bit of headache in terms of trying to figure out narrative style, trying to figure out how it's all going to weave together. And yeah, I mean, like I'm in the part that is historical, and so it is really fascinating. But even then, I'm like, half of these words could have been taken out, and the point would have gotten across. And like the labor history is really important because when, at least in the Asian American activist world, when we think of who are the first Asian American labor activists, it is Hawaiians. But like that's sort of touched upon, and it's very much like the violent pushback, not celebrating those heroes, which is fair. I mean, it's not the point of the book.
Yeah, I agree. To your point, I almost feel like the book could have been maybe two different books. Because I mean, I can't speak to the last part of the book, but the first, with the more historical context, could have been separate, and then like a sequel with the present day generation.
So I want to give people an opportunity to maybe express anything else about the book that they haven't been able to yet. And if we've exhausted the book, I can just talk about what's coming up next month. It looks like we've exhausted our comments about this book. So next month is Heart the Size of a Fist by Sunil Yapa. He's Sri Lankan American, but the book is about estranged adult son and father who find themselves at the same protests on opposite sides. And it's been well received by critics. So I'm hoping that it lives up to the promise. I'm like, sorry, Ms. Davenport. This one, although acclaimed, was not living up to the hype. But I thank you everyone for joining us in this journey in this book club. And as always, we really enjoy having these conversations and talking about literature with everyone at the Ann Arbor District Library.
Thank you. Yes. And even like, despite what anyone thinks of the book, I think these conversations are always so valuable, and I never leave one without extra insight or thoughts I didn't even have to begin with. So I always appreciate it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great week. Bye.
You too. Bye.